Today we're talking to media history professor Frank Kessler. It's really nice to meet you and talk to you about your research interests and experiences working at Utrecht University. Maybe I'd like to begin this interview from asking you about your research interests, because we know that you were focusing on early cinema and different acting styles. Could you maybe elaborate about that?
So my research really is dedicated to early cinema. That means film between 1895 and the First World War, roughly speaking. I do research in different aspects of that early cinema. So one of the main objects of my research has been a genre called féerie, where you have lots of magic tricks and magic acts taking place. So it's a really interesting and very charming genre that comes out of a theatrical stage tradition. I'm also quite interested in early documentary filmmaking, so this was for a long time my main research object, but then I've in the past years also dedicated a lot of research to the magic lantern. That is a medium that started way before cinema started.
Since you mentioned magic lanterns, maybe you could briefly introduce our viewers to what it is and why it's important to know about them.
Okay, now the magic lantern is a projection medium that was already invented in the 17th century, so it's going really way back. It was used a lot also to present magic things like demons and monsters, the devil, etc. And it was then turned into a commercial spectacle called phantasmagoria at the beginning of the 19th century. But then by the end of the 19th century it had become also a very important teaching tool, and that's what our research project is about. It's about how the magic lantern, or the optical lantern as it was then called, because they wanted to get rid of the connotations of magic, and that how that was used for teaching and knowledge dissemination both in public lectures and at the universities. And you could somehow think of it like the PowerPoint of the 19th century.
We also found out that movie Metropolis is extremely important in your research. Could you explain maybe like why you picked this movie in particular?
Okay, well that goes really back a long time. That was for my PhD thesis, which I did in France, and that basically came out of an interest I had for German silent cinema. When I studied in France, there was a retrospective at the Cinémathèque Française at the time where they showed lots of German silent films, and I read a lot about that, and it was also one of the genres of one of the periods that was quite prominent in teaching. I had a course, for instance, on German so-called expressionist cinema, and I was quite fascinated by that, but then also intrigued by the way in which that concept of expressionism was defined, and I found it very vague in a way. And so I had worked on that also for my master's thesis on expressionism, and then chose as an object for study for my PhD thesis the film Metropolis. And so I tried to see how the aesthetics of that film were influenced on the one hand by expressionist theatre in part, but that more importantly there was a concept of expressionism that existed in the discussions within the field of cinema technicians, in particular set designers who were thinking in terms of expressionism when they conceived of the settings, the decors of the films. And the idea was that a lot of meaning would be, as it were, integrated in the architecture, and that gave the frame for the actors then to play, and that the interaction between atmosphere that the architecture produced, the narrative, and the play of the actors would sort of create a filmic image that they characterized as being expressionist. And so that was part of the results of that thesis.
Since it's like such an important film, do you see influences of it in nowadays cinema, and like how it influenced like later periods of cinematography?
Well, Metropolis clearly is a classic that's been used a lot as a reference. Madonna was referring to Metropolis in one of her video clips at one point. But you could say also that a film like Blade Runner, in particular the first Blade Runner, is clearly inspired by Metropolis in its portrayal of the big city of Los Angeles in this film, and the flying objects, etc., which clearly are a reference to that film.
It's interesting to know how you got this interest in early cinema, because nowadays, like, people and society is not really focusing on early cinema, at least from our perspective. We don't really see a lot about early cinema in media nowadays.
Well, the first interest I developed was simply because it was a terrain that was very much discussed when I had finished my thesis. And so I became interested in these discussions. And what I found very fascinating in that is that this was a terrain that really was, we needed to rediscover. There had been lots of ideas circulating about early film, and when archives restored films and made them available in festivals, we realized that at least some of these stories did not work anymore. And so it was really something to rediscover. And what made it very interesting to me was that in order to understand the films, you needed to have theoretical concepts that allowed you to analyze them, and at the same time you needed also historical research about the context in which the films were shown in order to be able to create such a theoretical framework. So it was the combination of theory and history which I found extremely attractive. And I think it's extremely relevant to look at this historical period, because around 1900 we have a period where there is a very massive media change. Moving pictures do transform the media landscape quite importantly, and the somewhat neglected medium of the magic lantern is also part of that media landscape of the time. And that is something I think is very important to explore, because we understand how media change is working and is functioning, and this is something we are confronted with today, of course, with digital media once more in a similarly radical way.
Well, actually, while preparing for this interview, I watched a video interview with Martin Scorsese, who said that 90% of silent cinema is lost because of different formatting, and why nowadays people are not trying to preserve early cinema so it would not be like lost completely, at least if I understood correctly his statement.
No, I think what he was referring to the fact is that really a lot of the early films are lost. I mean, archives have been rediscovering quite a lot, and there's definitely much more that exists than people assumed, let's say 20 years ago. So we do have a rather rich legacy of early films. But what's true as well is that in that period nobody thought about archiving these films, or actually some people did think about archiving these films, but there were no film archives that really systematically took care of that. And film was a commercial product, so once it's been shown and once a print is worn, it was thrown away, or it was reused to recycle the celluloid or the silver which is in the emulsion, and so quite a lot of films got simply destroyed. And the other thing is that they were made on a nitrocellulose basis, which, if not stored very adequately, is decomposing. So also films that were in the archives turned out to be lost, because once people opened cans, they just had a block of film material which you couldn't disentangle anymore. So these films were also irretrievably lost. And that means that indeed, well, one could maybe debate the 90%, it's not quite clear what that's based on, but really an enormous amount of films was definitively lost. And so since the 1980s, archives have made really important efforts in preserving these films, and nowadays, of course, digital preservation methods help to safeguard this heritage.
Mm-hmm. What do you think modern filmmakers can learn from early cinema?
Basically, how to make films. I mean, it's what is very fascinating about this period is that many filmmakers just start to experiment. I mean, they have the possibility to film moving pictures. And how do you do that? How do you tell stories? How do you frame an image? How do you create a continuity between shots, etc.? So all these questions that filmmakers were engaging in extremely relevant to understand how filmmaking works, even though they did so in a different framework than filmmakers today.
Do you think like this structure, how the movies were created back then, would work in nowadays society when we are extremely used to like huge amount of effects and music and visual effects, etc.?
Well, it's always very difficult to recreate the impact that a film or that a media product had at its time, because our frame of reference, our way of looking at it is changing all the time. So this makes it also very difficult often to present early films to audiences today, and so there have been many people trying to find ways in showing them in such a way that people who are not film buffs or who are not film historians can rediscover the richness of these films. And that can be in their documentary value. Peter Jackson with his film about the First World War, with the footage that he reused, colorized and sonorized. I mean, one can again dispute the result of these operations, but that is a documentary value that these images have, which is very important. But also because they show us images of, in particular the documentary films show us images of places and people who have disappeared. And so there is a lot to be learned and to be experienced there, but you need to somehow curate such a presentation to translate the interest that one can have in these films to the audience. And so you do have also a lot of presentations with live music, for instance, which recreates sort of the spectacular side of film projection at that time.
Now I'd like to maybe move on to your career at Utrecht University, and it would be interesting to know how you ended up here.
How I ended up here?
Yeah.
I had started out at Nijmegen University, where I was in a program called Film and Performance Arts, Film and Opvoeringskunsten. And this was a very small program that also was under threat. And at some point it was clear that it couldn't continue as it originally was planned. And around that time there was also a possibility here to get an assistant professorship at Utrecht University. So I applied and I came here. And after a few years, there was a professorship in media history or film television history advertised, and I applied. And since 2001, I'm a professor of media history here.
Maybe you could share some of your most memorable moments while working here.
Well, to begin with, I think one thing that has struck me yesterday when we had the end of the year party of the department is how big we have grown. I mean, I have a photo somewhere where we had a meeting outside the university with all people involved in film studies at that time here in the department, or in the institute, which it was by then still. And we were 5 people. And now it's a huge amount of teachers, assistant professors, associate professors, other staff. We have a really gigantic program with many students every year. We have master's programs, we have a research master program. So that development has been really striking.
What do you think is the best part of being a lecturer in general?
Well, the best part are obviously the students and the contact with the students. That is something I really enjoyed throughout my career, having teaching and seeing how people develop ideas, find their way, learn, become partly researchers themselves. I mean, some of my colleagues here at the department have been my students before, so that is also very interesting development to see how someone become a colleague from being a student. So I think that is really very, very important. And the other thing is, of course, that you are working about something that you are really, really passionate about and interested in, and that is not in many professions that you can do that in that way, and despite all institutional constraints, also in that liberty.
To end this interview, I would actually ask you maybe have some insights or advices for aspiring scholars and students who are maybe now in the struggle or lack motivation.
Well, I think first of all you need to find out what you are really interested in and what you need to learn in order to do something with that interest. So our colleague Rosie Praidotti, who gave her valedictory lecture a few weeks ago, said, well, read, 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 and read even more. Go to the libraries, read books. I mean, you can read also on an electronic device, but I still would think that reading books is something that is very, very helpful and in developing an interest in things, learning about things, and using your knowledge in order to explore new domains, things that are part of our environment and need to be researched. And I think the university is a wonderful place for doing that. And also as a student you have a liberty that you probably never ever have again later in your life of doing something that you're really passionate about.
That's very nice advice. Thank you so much, and thank you for giving us your time to share your contributions to the department and to Utrecht University. It was really nice to meet you. Thank you.
Nice meeting you, and thanks.
Thank you.